Marcus Wright had grown accustomed to the stares, the whispers, the subtle pauses whenever he walked into spaces people didn't expect him to belong, but today, on the morning flight from New York to Los Angeles, he had hoped for something different, just a quiet journey where he could close his eyes, sip his coffee, and reflect on the years of battles he had fought both on foreign soil and in boardrooms that demanded a different kind of courage. He carried himself with the grace of a man who had nothing to prove yet the unshakable bearing of someone who had endured trials most could never imagine, and when he stepped into the first-class cabin, sharply dressed in a navy blue suit, polished shoes, and carrying only a sleek leather briefcase, he gave off the aura of calm authority that drew attention without effort, yet he could feel the invisible lines being drawn around him, the quick glances that tried to measure him, the eyes that silently questioned his presence, and it was not long before one voice, shrill, entitled, piercing, broke through the quiet hum of the cabin and shattered the fragile stillness, a voice that would ignite the storm that revealed to everyone not only who Marcus truly was but also how blind arrogance could unravel itself in seconds. "Excuse me? Excuse me," came the voice of a woman behind him, dripping with indignation, carrying that peculiar tone of superiority that belonged to people who believed money purchased decency, and when Marcus turned his head slightly, he saw her, late 40s, bleached blonde hair styled stiffly, diamonds glittering on her neck and wrists as though they alone validated her worth. Her lips pursed in disdain as she looked him over like an intruder who had wandered into forbidden territory. Her name, as he would later learn, was Karen, but even now, before her name was spoken, she radiated the essence of what the world had come to call a Karen, entitled, loud, and convinced that the universe revolved around her. "This is first class," she spat, narrowing her eyes at Marcus, her voice rising so passengers 3 rows back could hear, "You must be lost. Coach is that way." The words hung heavy in the air, drawing gasps and whispers, a ripple of discomfort through the other travelers, some shifting in their seats, some staring openly to see how the scene would unfold, and the flight attendants, frozen for a split second, quickly recovered with polite professionalism, one stepping forward to intervene, but Marcus did not move. He simply slid his briefcase beneath his seat, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, and replied with a calm, even tone that carried more weight than shouting ever could, "I'm exactly where I belong." For most men, that answer might have been the end of it, but not for Karen, whose entitlement was fueled not by reason but by ego, and the more composed Marcus remained, the more her fury grew, like a fire denied oxygen yet determined to burn. "No, no, I don't think so," she snapped, standing half out of her seat, waving her boarding pass like a weapon. "I paid thousands for this ticket, thousands, and there's no way someone like you—" Her words dropped into an ugly hiss, her face twisting as she gestured at him, "could possibly afford this." The air thickened with tension, a suffocating silence pressing down on the cabin as passengers turned away in embarrassment or leaned forward in fascination, unwilling to miss what was becoming a public spectacle, and Marcus, who had faced enemy fire, who had negotiated hostage releases, who had stared down the barrels of rifles in deserts halfway across the world, simply folded his hands in his lap and waited, not for permission, not for validation, but for the right moment to respond, because experience had taught him that sometimes silence spoke louder than fury, and sure enough, within moments, the captain himself, alerted by the disruption, stepped out from the cockpit, his presence commanding instant quiet. He was a seasoned pilot, silver-haired, steady-eyed, the kind of man who had flown dignitaries and diplomats, and when his gaze swept the cabin and fell on Marcus, his entire demeanor shifted in an instant, recognition flickered across his face, his posture straightened, and his voice, calm but edged with respect, broke the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce our VIP passenger. This is General Marcus Wright, retired 4-star General of the United States Army, recipient of the Medal of Honor, and one of the most decorated servicemen in modern history, a man who has commanded troops, advised presidents, and protected freedoms you enjoy today." The silence that followed was deafening, eyes widened, jaws dropped, even the flight attendants seemed frozen, their practiced professionalism giving way to awe as the weight of the revelation settled in. Marcus, the man Karen had accused of not belonging, was not only someone who belonged. He was someone who had given his life, his service, his very soul to earn a place anywhere he chose to sit. Slowly, Marcus inclined his head, his voice calm yet carrying to every corner of the cabin. "I came here to read my book in peace, not to remind anyone that dignity isn't measured by skin color or the seat on a plane." His words were a quiet thunder, shaking the very ground of entitlement on which Karen stood, and her reaction was instant. Her face drained of color, her jewelry clinking faintly as her hands trembled, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, searching for excuses that would not come, because the truth had silenced her more effectively than any argument ever could. Around her, passengers shifted, their eyes heavy with judgment. A man across the aisle muttered, "Shameful," while an elderly couple shook their heads, and even her own seatmate leaned away as though her humiliation might stain him by proximity. For the first time in perhaps her entire life, Karen had no retort, no clever insult, no shield of arrogance strong enough to withstand the weight of what she had done. She sank slowly into her seat, trembling, diminished, her earlier shrieks reduced to silence, while Marcus, unbothered, reopened his briefcase, pulled out his book, and flipped it open, the very picture of unshakable composure. Yet beneath the surface, his mind churned, not with anger but with memory, of the countless times he had seen this same look, this same disbelief, when people confronted the reality of who he was, when assumptions born of prejudice collided with the truth of his achievements, and though he carried himself with grace, he could not help but feel the ache of how deeply rooted such ignorance remained. Still, as the plane prepared for takeoff, the captain returning to the cockpit, the flight attendants resuming their duties with newfound deference, and the passengers settling into a silence heavy with reflection, Marcus knew one thing with absolute certainty: dignity was not given, it was not bought, it was not granted by the likes of Karen, it was earned, lived, and carried like a banner, and in that moment, he carried it not just for himself but for every person who had ever been told they did not belong. And as the engines roared to life and the plane lifted into the sky, the lesson lingered in the cabin, unspoken yet undeniable, that arrogance crumbles in the face of truth, that prejudice falters before honor, and that sometimes, the quiet strength of a man who refuses to bow speaks louder than the screams of those who believe the world is theirs alone.